There is a specific, dangerous silence right before a loyal canine decides you've crossed the line. It's the exact same silence a broken man carries when he is finally done running. I'm Wilder. I've spent my life out in the deep timber, learning that animals are far better company than most folks. Tonight's story takes us away from these woods to a cold San Francisco street. It's about what happens when arrogant power meets a quiet veteran and a dog who hasn't forgotten how to go to war. Pull up a chair to the fire. Let me know what city or state you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you value a story told the honest way. Let's begin. The sharp, violent crack of porcelain shattering against wet concrete severed the morning hum of the city. A scalding pool of crimson broth bled across the pavement, soaking immediately into the frayed, thin fabric covering the knees of a 70-year-old woman. She was frantically scraping her bare, trembling fingers against the jagged ceramic shards, desperately trying to salvage what was left of her livelihood. Standing directly over her, casting a long, oppressive shadow through the dense San Francisco fog, was a pair of polished, tactical leather boots. Above the boots, a city cop wore a smug, unbothered smirk, watching the old woman bleed. The coastal fog had rolled in heavy that morning, clinging to the brick facades of the Mission District. Beneath the gray canopy, the rich, complex aroma of bún riêu, a slow-simmered Vietnamese crab and tomato broth laced with fermented shrimp paste, battled against the sharp scent of bus exhaust and damp asphalt. For years, Mrs. Mai had anchored this corner. Her dented aluminum food cart was a tiny fortress of survival, her weathered hands serving warmth to day laborers and passing commuters. But Officer Derek Vance didn't care about survival. He cared about authority, and to him, the cart was an eyesore. The smell offended him. The way it occupied 18 inches of his sidewalk offended him. Wearing crisp navy blues, mirrored aviator sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and a badge pinned over a chest that had never known a real fight, Derek was a man desperate to wield power. He hadn't asked her for her permit. He hadn't given a verbal warning. He had simply walked up, curled his lip in disgust, and delivered a heavy, calculated kick to the cart's aluminum kickstand. The metal structure shrieked. The massive vat of boiling broth sloshed violently over the rim. A freshly plated bowl resting on the counter tipped, fell, and exploded on the ground. Mrs. Mai dropped to the concrete instantly. "I am sorry, I clean," she whispered, her English fracturing under the weight of sheer panic. Steam rose from her wet, burned hands, but she didn't stop gathering the broken pieces. Derek adjusted his heavy utility belt, letting out a short, hollow laugh that echoed off the brick walls. "You're a public hazard, lady. Get this garbage off my sidewalk before I write you a citation you can't afford." The cruelty wasn't an accident. It was a performance. He looked around, daring anyone to challenge the uniform. Across the street, standing near a rusted newspaper box, the steam from a paper coffee cup curled past Elena Rostova's face. Her sharp, dark eyes darted from the spilled broth to the silver badge gleaming on Derek's chest. As an independent investigative journalist, she recognized the Vance name immediately. She knew the corrupt real estate money his family controlled, the shadow campaigns pushing to gentrify this exact block, the quiet evictions. Without making a single sudden movement, Elena slipped her smartphone from her coat pocket. Her thumb tapped the screen. The red recording dot began to blink steadily, capturing every second of the abuse. The dozen bystanders on the corner remained frozen. It was an involuntary ring of spectators, paralyzed by the inherent threat of the blue uniform and the baton resting on Derek's hip. Then, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a sudden, chilling drop in the barometric pressure of the street. The paralyzed crowd didn't just step aside. They recoiled. They parted silently, pulling their shoulders back like water yielding to the slow glide of a predator. Caleb Thorne stepped into the clearing. He didn't stomp. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate stillness of a man who had spent a decade navigating hostile territory where a misplaced footstep meant death. He wore a faded olive canvas jacket, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands hanging loosely, dangerously, at his sides. His face was a map of quiet endurance, hollowed cheeks, a shadow of stubble, and eyes that held the cold, empty depth of a winter ocean. Beside him, tethered by a loose leather leash that hung entirely slack, walked Brutus. The Belgian Malinois had a coat the color of burnt earth, and a jagged, pale scar slicing diagonally across his dark snout. The dog's amber eyes were locked onto Derek with a chilling, unwavering focus. Caleb stopped exactly 3 feet from the officer. Derek's smirk faltered. The instinctual arrogance in his chest collided with a sudden, primal alarm. He didn't see a citizen standing before him. His nervous system registered a lethal threat. Derek's hand twitched, instinctively dropping toward the black handle of his baton. Caleb didn't posture. He didn't raise his voice. He simply lowered his gaze to the bleeding broth, looked at Mrs. Mai's trembling hands, and then locked his dead eyes onto Derek's mirrored lenses. His voice was gravel and rusted iron, a sound stripped of all emotion, echoing with the absolute authority of a SEAL team commander. "Pick it up." Derek's face flushed with violent heat. His ego flared, fighting the terror in his gut. "Back off, vagrant. You're interfering with police business." Before Derek's fingers could even wrap around the handle of his weapon, the air vibrated. It didn't start as a bark. It was a guttural, chest-rattling frequency emanating from deep within Brutus's ribcage, a low, mechanical hum of pure, lethal intent that seemed to shake the concrete. The Malinois bared his teeth, exposing long, pristine white fangs against dark gums. Every muscle in the dog's lean body coiled like high-tension wire. It was a sound engineered by years of military training, a sound that communicated one undeniable, bloody truth. If you pull that weapon, your arm will be severed before it clears the holster. The blood drained entirely from Derek's face. The mirrored glasses couldn't hide the sudden, raw terror paralyzing his features. His hand froze over the baton. He was suffocating in the heavy, suffocating silence of the street. Caleb didn't blink. The command hung in the fog, heavier and sharper than before. "I said, pick it up." Derek swallowed hard, his throat dry as bone. The power dynamic had flipped so violently, it left the entire block breathless. Slowly, humiliatingly, the officer bent his knees. The fabric of his pristine uniform brushed against the dirty, wet concrete. His shaking hands reached out, pinching a jagged shard of broken porcelain covered in red oil. "I'm sorry," Derek muttered to the pavement, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Louder," Caleb whispered. "I'm sorry," Derek forced out, his voice cracking, humiliated before the dozens of eyes watching him. As the young cop stood, backing away with a burned ego and eyes swimming in venomous rage, Caleb knelt smoothly to the ground. Brutus stepped forward, his aggressive posture melting instantly. The scarred canine lowered his large head, gently nudging Mrs. Mai's trembling, soup-stained fingers with his wet nose. A soft, warm puff of air, a silent anchor in the storm. The crowd exhaled, a collective breath they didn't know they were holding, and instinctively shuffled closer, forming a loose, protective human wall behind Caleb and the old woman. Across the street, Elena lowered her phone. Her heart was hammering violently against her ribs. She had the footage, every frame of it. But as Derek Vance climbed into his cruiser, slamming the heavy door and staring through the windshield with a glare that promised absolute retribution, Elena felt a cold dread wash over her. This wasn't the end of a confrontation. It was the match striking the powder keg. And Caleb Thorne, the ghost who just wanted to be left alone in the shadows, had just painted a massive, glowing target on his own back. The internet doesn't bleed, but it catches fire just as fast. By midnight, the quiet obscurity Caleb Thorne had spent years building was completely incinerated, his face burning across a million glowing screens. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of the SFPD 8th District, Officer Derek Vance wasn't bleeding either, though his pride had been violently fractured. He stood rigidly at attention before Captain Miller. But Miller wasn't yelling about police brutality. He wasn't yelling about Mrs. Mai's shattered bowl. He casually tossed a sleek tablet onto the center of his heavy oak desk. The video was paused exactly on Derek's terrified, humiliated face as he bent to pick up the porcelain. "I don't give a damn about a street vendor, Vance," Miller growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of pure corporate politics. "But your father is closing a $90 million acquisition on that exact block next week. You think Vanguard Holdings wants a viral civil rights nightmare, right when they're quietly trying to rezone the slums?" Derek's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ground together. It was never about the badge or the law. It was about clearing the board. His father, Arthur Vance, had spent 2 years buying out landlords and intimidating tenants. Mrs. Mai and the other vendors were the last holdouts. And Derek, in his arrogant attempt to play king of the sidewalk, had just put a massive spotlight on the exact corner his family needed kept in the dark. Across the city, bathed in the blue light of a dual-monitor setup, Elena Rostova was staring at the exact same truth. Her apartment was a mess of empty coffee cups and highlighted public records. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, tracing the shell corporations holding the eviction notices for Mrs. Mai's block. Apex Realty, Bayview Ventures, Vanguard Holdings, all arrows pointed to Arthur Vance. The eviction wasn't municipal cleanup. It was a targeted corporate siege, and the quiet, terrifying man with the scarred Malinois had just planted his boots right on the fault line. Caleb didn't own a smartphone, but he didn't need one to know the world had found him. The assault started at 8 a.m. It wasn't bullets, it was knuckles on cheap plywood. Heavy, frantic knocking at his apartment door. Voices echoing loudly in the narrow, claustrophobic hallway. Shouts filtering up from the street below. "Mr. Thorne, are you in there? Channel 4 News, just one statement." Camera flashes strobe lit the edges of his drawn blackout curtains, slicing through the safety of his dark living room like tracer fire in a night sky. Sensory overload. Caleb backed away from the window, his breath hitching, catching sharply in his chest. The pounding on the door began to morph. It wasn't knuckles on wood anymore. It was the rhythmic, deafening thud of a Black Hawk rotor cutting through heavy, suffocating desert air. The smell of stale hallway carpet vanished, violently replaced by the choking, metallic stench of cordite, burning diesel, and copper blood. He slid down the plaster wall, clutching his head, his knuckles turning bone white. The apartment walls dissolved into the blinding, chaotic dust of the Korengal Valley. Ambush. Muzzle flashes blinking violently in the distant ridgeline. The screams of his squadmates bleeding through the radio static. The walls of his chest compressed like a vice. He was drowning in dry air. His hands shook violently, scraping frantically against his own knees, as his muscle memory tried to find a rifle that wasn't there. He was trapped in the loop. The ghost of the war had found the breach, and it was dragging him back under. Then came the pressure, heavy, warm, and deliberate. Brutus didn't whine. The Malinois didn't bark at the chaotic noise outside the door. He understood the invisible battlefield in Caleb's mind better than any human ever could. The canine stepped over Caleb's thrashing legs, forced his large, scarred head beneath Caleb's crossed, defensive arms, and drove his 60 pounds of solid weight squarely onto Caleb's chest. Deep pressure therapy. Brutus pressed his dark muzzle hard against Caleb's jaw, forcing physical, grounding contact. Caleb gasped, his eyes wild and unseeing in the pitch black. But beneath the phantom gunfire, he felt it. Thump, thump, thump. Brutus's slow, steady heartbeat vibrating through the dog's ribcage directly into his own. An anchor dropped into a raging, violent sea. Caleb's shaking hand slowly uncurled, his fingers burying deep into the thick, coarse fur of the dog's neck. He buried his face in Brutus's coat, pulling ragged, desperate breaths until the desert dust finally faded back into the damp chill of San Francisco. "Good boy," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking, tears of absolute exhaustion stinging his eyes in the dark. "I'm here. I'm here." It wasn't until 3 a.m. that the hallway finally fell dead silent. The vultures had grown bored and left to chase another headline. Caleb quietly unlocked his door, the hinges protesting with a low, metallic squeak. The hallway was empty, lit only by a single flickering fluorescent bulb at the far end. But right at the threshold of his door sat a small, grease-stained cardboard bakery box. Caleb crouched, his tactical instincts flaring, but Brutus simply sniffed the cardboard and gave a soft, relaxed tail wag. Caleb opened the lid. Inside rested 3 perfectly golden, sugar-dusted churros, still faintly warm to the touch. Tucked beside them was a cheap paper napkin with 2 words written in shaky blue ballpoint ink. "Thank you, Luis," the taco vendor from the corner next to Mrs. Mai. Caleb stared at the napkin, a strange, tight knot forming in his throat. He had spent years trying to build a fortress to keep humanity out, but humanity had just crept past his walls to leave a quiet offering at his door. For a fleeting second, the coldness in his chest thawed. But as Caleb stood up, looking down the long, empty corridor, the flickering fluorescent light caught a dark shadow shifting at the far end of the hall. A heavy, boot-clad footstep scraped aggressively against the linoleum. Brutus's ears instantly pinned back flat against his skull. The low, rumbling hum of pure violence vibrated in the dog's throat once again. The media was gone, but Derek Vance hadn't forgotten the humiliation, and cowards always return in the dark. The coward's logic is devastatingly simple. If you are too afraid to hunt the wolf in the dark, you slaughter the sheep in the daylight. The shadow that had lingered outside Caleb's door the night before hadn't knocked. Derek Vance had realized that a narrow, dimly lit hallway was Caleb's territory. So, at high noon the following day, the metallic, violent screech of a police cruiser mounting the sidewalk shattered the afternoon rhythm of the Mission District. The heavy vehicle didn't just park. It aggressively boxed in Mrs. Mai's aluminum cart, its front bumper mere inches from her boiling pots. Derek stepped out, flanked by two heavily muscled, grim-faced officers. The neon reflection of the cruiser's flashing lights painted the fog in erratic, panicked strokes of red and blue. Mrs. Mai froze, her ladle trembling in midair. The bustling corner instantly went dead quiet. Derek didn't bother with the smirk this time. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic cruelty. Code 402, Section B. Unsanitary street vending, he barked, his voice loud enough to echo off the brick storefronts. This entire setup is a public health hazard. We're confiscating the cart. No, please, I have paper, I have permit, Mrs. Mai pleaded, her voice breaking as she scrambled to pull a crumpled, laminated city license from her apron pocket. Derek swatted her hand away. The laminated paper fluttered to the wet asphalt. Permits revoked, he lied smoothly, nodding to his men. Bag the cash box, trash the soup. What Derek didn't know, what no one on the street knew, was that the cheap plastic flower pin fastened to the collar of Mrs. Mai's apron was not a decoration. From the tinted window of a rusted sedan parked 50 feet away, Elena Rostova sat perfectly still, her headphones pressed hard against her ears. She held a digital audio recorder. The red needle was jumping with perfect clarity. She had approached Mrs. Mai at dawn, pinning the hidden mic to her collar, sensing that a wounded predator like Derek would inevitably return for easy prey. As the two backup cops violently shoved the aluminum cart, knocking over a stack of porcelain bowls, Mrs. Mai's faded yellow apron tore loose and fell to the dirty ground. She wept, entirely defenseless. Derek leaned in close, his mouth inches from her ear, unaware of the tiny microphone recording his every breath. "I told you to clear out, you old parasite," Derek whispered, his voice a venomous hiss. "By next month, my father's bulldozers are going to wipe this entire pathetic block off the map. You are nothing." Elena's eyes widened in the sedan. Vanguard Holdings, the bulldozers. Derek had just handed her the smoking gun, wrapping his family's corporate conspiracy in an illegal police threat. But a recording couldn't stop the cops from taking the cart right now. Before Derek could order his men to hook the cart to the cruiser's tow line, the heavy rhythmic click of tactical boots hitting the pavement cut through the noise. The crowd parted. Caleb Thorne walked into the flashing red and blue lights. His jaw was set in granite. Brutus trotted silently at his left side. When Caleb saw Mrs. Mai crying, looking at her ruined bowls, a dangerous, electric heat surged up his spine. The phantom smell of cordite and blood tried to flood his brain. The primal, violent instinct of the Navy SEAL screamed at him to close the distance, to break the officer's knee, to neutralize the threat with extreme prejudice. But as Caleb looked at the terrified faces of the crowd, the war in his mind suddenly went quiet. He wasn't in the Korengal Valley. He wasn't a weapon of destruction anymore. He was a shield. Caleb didn't yell. He didn't raise a fist. He simply walked to the front of Derek's idling police cruiser, stepped squarely in front of the massive chrome grille, and stopped. He crossed his arms over his broad chest. He planted his boots shoulder-width apart. He became a mountain. Brutus immediately sat beside his right leg, a perfect statue of disciplined, lethal potential. Derek spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to his sidearm. "Thorne," he spat, his voice trembling with a mix of fury and fear. "Move away from the vehicle. You are interfering with a lawful confiscation. I will arrest you right here." Caleb didn't blink. He didn't speak. He just stared through the windshield, utterly immovable. "I said move!" Derek yelled, his hand unholstering his baton, his two backup officers stepping forward, their hands resting cautiously on their weapons. The tension was a pulled guitar string, seconds away from snapping into a bloodbath. Then, the true miracle of the street happened. A heavy, grease-stained work boot stepped off the curb. Luis, the taco vendor, wiped his hands on a towel, walked past the cops, and stood shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. He crossed his arms. A moment later, a young man wearing a half-tied barber's cape walked out of his shop and stood on Caleb's other side. Then a delivery driver. Then a local mechanic holding a wrench. Then a mother holding her teenager's hand. One by one, the terrified, marginalized people of the block stepped off the sidewalk. They formed a solid, unyielding wall of human bodies, directly in front of the police cruiser, completely surrounding Caleb and Mrs. Mai. No one shouted. No one threw a punch. They just stood there, borrowing the profound, terrifying courage of the quiet veteran. Derek froze. His baton hung useless in his hand. He was prepared to bully a frail old woman. He was even prepared to try and shoot Caleb. But he could not run over 30 citizens in broad daylight, in front of dozens of raised cell phone cameras. The sheer weight of their silent defiance crushed his authority into dust. Caleb looked at the people standing beside him. For the first time since the war, the hollow void in his chest filled with something resembling warmth. He had spent his entire life learning how to bleed for his country. But today, he realized that true warfare didn't always require pulling a trigger. Sometimes, victory was simply standing your ground and refusing to let the darkness advance. Brutus broke formation. The Malinois padded softly over to the dirty, tear-stained pavement. He opened his jaws, carefully picking up Mrs. Mai's fallen yellow apron. The dog walked over to the weeping grandmother and gently pressed the fabric into her trembling hands, looking up at her with soft, amber eyes. Mrs. Mai clutched the apron to her chest, sobbing quietly, completely sheltered behind the wall of her neighbors. Derek's face was completely flushed, his chest heaving with humiliated rage. He pointed a shaking finger at Caleb through the crowd. "This isn't over," he mouthed silently, eyes burning with a promise of absolute destruction. "You're dead." He violently shoved his baton back into its holster, screaming at his men to get back in the cruiser. They threw it into reverse, tires screeching in defeat as they sped away from the blockade. Across the street, inside the rusted sedan, Elena took off her headphones. She looked at the blinking red light of her recorder. Derek thought he had just issued a death sentence. But as Elena pressed save on the audio file that contained the confession of Vanguard Holdings' illegal eviction scheme, she allowed herself a cold, razor-sharp smile. "No, Derek," she thought, staring at the retreating taillights. "You are." Rain lashed against the cracked glass of the midnight diner like handfuls of thrown gravel, blurring the neon sign into a bleeding, electric haze. A human shield only buys you time, and Caleb Thorne, staring into the black depths of a bitter coffee, knew their time was rapidly bleeding out. Standing in front of a police cruiser was a tactical delay, but a military mind understands that if you don't transition from defense to offense, the enemy will simply regroup, rearm, and return with overwhelming force. Caleb couldn't protect Mrs. Mai every single hour of the day. He needed a strategy. He needed a strike. Across the sticky Formica booth, Elena Rostova slid a silver digital recorder across the table. "Press play," she said, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering diner lights. Caleb pressed the button. Through the static, Derek Vance's venomous hiss filled the space between them. "By next month, my father's bulldozers are going to wipe this entire pathetic block off the map." "You are nothing." Caleb stopped the tape. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his jawline. He looked down at the sprawling mess of highlighted bank statements, property deeds, and corporate shell names Elena had scattered across the table. "Vanguard Holdings," Elena whispered, tapping a manicured fingernail against a document. "Derek's father, Arthur Vance, is using the police department as his personal eviction squad to tank property values. Once the vendors flee, he buys the block for pennies. But I need more than one recorded threat. I need a pattern. I need witnesses. Civilians run when the shooting starts," Caleb said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "You're asking terrified, marginalized people to stand up against a badge and billions of dollars." "Yesterday they didn't run," Elena countered, leaning in. "Because of you. They need a commander, Caleb. They need to know someone is holding the line." Caleb looked down at Brutus, who was resting his heavy, scarred head on Caleb's combat boots beneath the table. The Malinois let out a soft huff. Caleb closed his eyes, the phantom echoes of a ruined desert valley threatening to surface, but he pushed them down. This wasn't Afghanistan. This was his home now. "Tonight," Caleb said, opening his eyes, the cold, strategic calculation of a SEAL team operator locking into place. "We rally the troops." 3 miles away, inside the claustrophobic darkness of an unmarked police cruiser, Derek Vance was suffocating. The rain hammered against the roof of the car. The heater was blasting, but Derek was shivering. His sweaty palms slipped against the leather steering wheel as he aggressively jabbed a number into his phone. The arrogance that had fueled him for years was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, rabid panic of a cornered animal. "Dad," Derek gasped the second the line connected. "Dad, we have a problem." "I told you never to call me on this line, Derek." Arthur Vance's voice was as cold and immaculate as a marble floor. "A journalist," Derek stammered, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Elena Rostova. A buddy in cybercrimes just flagged her IP. She's not just looking at the street citations, Dad. She's pulling the Cayman Island routing numbers. She knows about Vanguard." A suffocating, terrible silence fell over the line. When Arthur finally spoke, the disappointment in his voice was sharper than a scalpel. "You were supposed to clear a sidewalk, Derek. Instead, you made a scene. You became a viral laughingstock, and now you've led a bloodhound straight to my vault." "I can fix it," Derek begged, his chest heaving. "I just need..." "You have done enough," Arthur interrupted, his tone chillingly flat. "I am stepping in. I will handle the journalist. I will handle the veteran. Do not do anything else, Derek." "You are officially a liability." The line went dead. Derek stared at the black screen, his breathing ragged. Being a bully was one thing. Being deemed a liability by Arthur Vance was a death sentence. Derek threw the phone violently against the passenger window. He wasn't going to wait for his father to clean up his mess. If he was going down, he was going to burn the whole street down with him. Back in the Mission District, hidden from the main street, a thick blue plastic tarp stretched across a narrow alleyway behind Mrs. Mai's apartment. The heavy scent of star anise, crab paste, and simmered tomatoes cut fiercely through the damp chill of the night. Beneath the tarp, a single, warm yellow bulb illuminated a small, huddled group of people. Luis the taco vendor was there, the local barber, 3 day laborers, and Mrs. Mai, stirring a massive, steaming aluminum pot. They were shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying reality of what they were doing. Caleb stood at the edge of the light. He didn't offer them false comfort, he gave them truth. Fear is a mechanism, it keeps you alive. Caleb's deep voice resonated in the cramped alley, commanding absolute attention. But if you let them weaponize it, you've already lost. Derek Vance relies on your silence. Tomorrow, the silence ends. Elena stepped forward, handing out thick stacks of sworn affidavit forms. "We put everything in writing, every threat, every broken cart, every bribe. Once we file these simultaneously to the state attorney general, Derek's badge won't protect him, but I need all of you. 1 voice is a complaint, 30 voices is an indictment." Luis took a pen. Without a word, he signed his name. The barber followed. Then, one by one, the terrified ghosts of the sidewalk transformed into an army of witnesses. Mrs. Mai wiped a tear from her wrinkled cheek. She picked up a chipped porcelain bowl, filled it with steaming golden Boon Rio, and walked over to Caleb. She didn't speak. She just pressed the hot bowl into his large, calloused hands. Caleb looked at the rich broth, the floating crab cakes, the vibrant green onions. He had spent years eating MREs in the dirt and choking down cold food in a dark apartment. He raised the chopsticks, taking his first bite. The warmth was absolute. It wasn't just a flavor, it was the taste of home, of care, of a community surviving against the odds. Slowly, the rigid, frozen lines of Caleb's face broke. A genuine, quiet smile touched his lips. It was the first time he had smiled in 6 years. At his feet, Brutus happily chewed on a plain, unseasoned chunk of boiled pork Mrs. Mai had dropped for him, his tail thumping against the wet asphalt. For 10 minutes, under the blue tarp, there was peace. But war never waits for peace to settle. Elena's phone, resting on a plastic crate, suddenly vibrated violently. She glanced at the screen. Her face went entirely pale. The warm atmosphere in the alley instantly vanished. "Caleb," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb dropped his chopsticks, his tactical instincts instantly flaring. "What is it?" Elena slowly turned the phone screen toward him. It was a single, anonymous text message, but it wasn't a threat of legal action. It was a photo. It was a picture of Caleb, taken through the crosshairs of a telescopic rifle sight. Beneath the image was one line of text: "The shield breaks tonight." A sniper's crosshair is only terrifying if you don't know how to hunt in the dark. The moment Caleb saw the photograph on Elena's phone, he didn't freeze and he didn't panic. In a fraction of a second, he killed the single alley light, shoved the civilians behind the thick brick wall of the bakery, and let the Navy SEAL take over. They spent 6 agonizing hours in the pitch-black alleyway, breathing damp dust, with Brutus silently pacing the perimeter. But the bullet never shattered the night. The text message had been a bluff, a desperate psychological strike ordered by Arthur Vance's fixers to scatter the witnesses before dawn. But Caleb Thorne wasn't a sheep, and he didn't scatter. At exactly 6 a.m., as the gray San Francisco fog finally cracked to reveal a pale morning sun, Elena Rostova didn't run. She hit publish. The investigative report hit the internet not like a spark, but like a tactical nuke. The Vanguard Syndicate, how SFPD badges built a corporate empire. Embedded at the very top of the front page was the crisp, undeniable audio file of Derek Vance illegally threatening an old woman to clear the block for his father's bulldozers. By 7 a.m., local news vans were swarming the Mission District. By 8 a.m., heavily armed FBI agents were violently kicking down the mahogany doors of Arthur Vance's penthouse, seizing corporate hard drives and offshore bank ledgers before the billionaire could even put on his designer tie. But Derek Vance didn't know that. At 9 a.m., the deafening screech of burning rubber tore through the neighborhood. Derek's police cruiser violently jumped the curb and slammed to a halt directly in front of Mrs. Mai's cart. The young officer who stumbled out of the driver's seat looked nothing like the arrogant bully from 2 days ago. His uniform was rumpled and sweat-stained. His eyes were bloodshot, sunken, and darting erratically. He hadn't slept. He had seen the article. His father's phone was going straight to voicemail, and the precinct brass had completely locked his credentials out of the police database. He had lost his family's empire, his badge, and his future in less than 3 hours. And when you strip a narcissist of his power, you don't get humility. You get a rabid animal. Derek ignored the dozen civilians, the rolling camera of a local news crew, and the sleek black SUVs of police internal affairs that were quietly pulling up to the far end of the block. His shaking, sweaty hand hovered aggressively over his heavy utility belt. "You!" Derek screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he pointed a trembling finger at Caleb, who was standing calmly beside Mrs. Mai. "You ruined my life! I am a Vance! You are a piece of street trash!" Caleb didn't flinch. His posture was utterly relaxed, his broad shoulders loose, his hands open and empty by his sides. "It's over, Derek," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut cleanly through the manic shouting. "Stand down." "Shut up!" Derek shrieked, spit flying from his lips. The manic panic completely overrode his academy training. His hand dropped. The metallic snick of his Glock 19, clearing its Kydex holster, sent a violent shockwave of absolute terror through the crowd. People screamed. Mothers violently pulled their children to the concrete. Coffee cups dropped and shattered. A firearm had been drawn in a crowded street. Lethal danger. Time slowed to a crawl. But Caleb didn't reach for a weapon he didn't have. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply dropped his left shoulder, locked eyes with his dog, and hissed one sharp, explosive syllable. Strike. Brutus didn't run. He launched. 60 pounds of Belgian Malinois muscle and bone became a brown, heat-seeking missile. A kinetic force of pure, highly trained violence, bridging the 10 feet of asphalt in less than a single second. Derek barely had time to raise the barrel of the 9mm before Brutus collided with him. The K9 didn't go for the throat. Military dogs are trained to neutralize the weapon. Brutus's jaws snapped shut over Derek's right forearm with the crushing, bone-bruising force of a hydraulic press. Derek's scream was a high, agonizing shriek of pure agony. The heavy Glock clattered uselessly onto the wet street, spinning into the gutter. The sheer momentum of the dog's airborne strike slammed the officer violently backward, pinning him against the hot hood of his own police cruiser. Brutus held the grip, his back paws planted firmly on the asphalt, violently thrashing his massive head to disorient the threat, emitting a guttural, terrifying roar that froze the blood of everyone watching. It was the ultimate, cathartic shattering of an untouchable ego. Derek collapsed to the pavement, sobbing, pleading, completely reduced to a pathetic, weeping child in a torn uniform. "Get him off. Please, God, I'm sorry. Get him off," he wailed, tears streaming down his flushed, terrified face. The two internal affairs detectives, who had just sprinted onto the scene with their own weapons drawn, froze. They didn't aim at the dog. They aimed at Derek. Caleb walked forward slowly, his heavy combat boots crunching against the asphalt. There was no rage in his icy blue eyes, no vengeance, only the profound, heavy calm of a storm that had finally broken. He stopped next to the weeping, pathetic officer, knelt on one knee, and placed a gentle, steadying hand on the back of Brutus's neck. "Out," Caleb commanded softly. Instantly, Brutus released the bloody, bruised arm. The Malinois stepped back, sitting perfectly obedient at Caleb's side, chest heaving, licking his chops, his amber eyes never leaving the target. The detectives moved in, violently ripping Derek's arms behind his back. The cold metal handcuffs ratcheted tight with a loud, definitive click. One detective reached out, grabbed the silver star pinned to Derek's chest, and ripped the badge violently from his uniform. For 5 agonizing seconds, the street was dead silent, save for Derek's pathetic sobbing, as he was shoved roughly into the back of the black SUV. Then, Luis the taco vendor started clapping. It started slow, a single set of heavy, calloused hands, but within seconds, the entire block erupted. The barber, the laborers, the neighbors, the news crew, they cheered, a roaring, deafening wave of relief, justice, and victory. Mrs. Mai wept openly, covering her face as Elena hugged her tightly. The digital recorder finally turned off. Caleb stood in the center of the noise. He looked at the faces of the people around him, faces that were no longer terrified, but radiant with hope. For years, he had been haunted by the lives he couldn't save in the desert. He had believed his combat skills were only meant for destruction, that his scarred hands were only built to break things. But as he looked down at Brutus, and then at the safe, smiling face of Mrs. Mai, the crushing, suffocating weight that had lived in his chest for 6 years finally fractured and blew away in the coastal wind. He wasn't a ghost anymore. His war was finally over. For the first time in his life, looking at the vibrant, messy, beautiful street, Caleb Thorne knew exactly what he was fighting for.
Clear space.
The sharp, suffocating stench of industrial bleach and wet fur is a very different kind of hell than a courtroom, but for a broken man, it serves the exact same purpose. Inside the deafening concrete corridor of the city's largest animal rescue shelter, a heavy wire bristle brush slipped from a trembling, blistered hand and clattered to the wet floor. Derek Vance, stripped of his tailored Navy uniform and drowning in a violently bright orange community service vest, backed against the cold cinder block wall. Inches from his face, separated only by a rusted chain-link fence, a massive, scarred pit bull lunged, its jaws snapping the air with a terrifying, hollow clack. Derek flinched hard, his breath hitching in raw, unadulterated terror. He instinctively reached for a baton that no longer existed. He was completely powerless. "Pick up the brush, Vance," a harsh, gravelly voice echoed down the hall. The shelter manager, a 60-year-old woman in rubber boots, didn't even look up from her clipboard. They smell fear, and they have a fantastic memory for bullies. Now get on your knees and scrub the blood out of that concrete. You've got 400 hours left. Derek stared at the dirty, wet floor. Slowly, agonizingly, his knees hit the concrete. It was the exact same posture he had been forced into 6 months ago, when a quiet veteran made him pick up pieces of a shattered porcelain bowl. The circle of his humiliation was absolute, and in the deafening barking of the kennels, Derek finally began to understand the agonizing weight of humility. 6 months. In a city that usually swallows its history in a matter of days, 6 months is enough time to build a miracle if the foundation is forged in fire. The suffocating gray fog that used to choke the Mission District had burned off, replaced by the warm, golden light of a late Tuesday afternoon. The rusted newspaper boxes and cracked, dirty asphalt were gone. In their place stood a vibrant, meticulously organized pedestrian plaza, framed by overhead string lights and a massive wrought iron archway that read, "Second Chance Corner." It was a sanctuary, built by the people, protected by the law, and paid for by the dismantling of Vanguard Holdings. Caleb Thorne stood near the entrance, his broad shoulders relaxed under a black canvas jacket, a radio clipped to his belt. He was the city-appointed security manager of the market, but to the 30 vendors operating under the bright awnings, he was something far more profound. He was their guardian. Suddenly, the vibrant hum of the market was violently pierced by the sharp, terrifying crash of shattering glass. A heavy wooden crate collapsed near the center aisle. A large man in a heavy coat stumbled backward, his arms flailing wildly, knocking over a display of bottled sodas. A young fruit vendor screamed, backing away in terror, as the large man let out a guttural, terrifying shout, his hands clawing at his own throat. Threat. The military reflex in Caleb's brain ignited instantly. The world tunneled. Brutus dropped his center of gravity, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Caleb closed the 40-foot distance in 3 seconds flat, his boots eating the pavement, his muscles coiled to neutralize a violent attacker. He breached the crowd, reaching out to grab the aggressive man by the collar to drive him to the asphalt. But as Caleb's hand made contact, the hidden truth of the chaos instantly revealed itself. The man's eyes were rolled back. His skin was pale, covered in a cold sweat. He wasn't attacking the vendor. He was suffocating. He was choking entirely on a piece of food, his brain misfiring in sheer panic as oxygen deprivation set in. The transition in Caleb's mind was immediate and breathtaking. He wasn't a weapon anymore. He didn't strike the man. Instead, Caleb seamlessly pivoted, wrapping his massive, powerful arms around the dying man's torso from behind. He locked his fists just above the sternum. "Clear the perimeter! Call 911!" Caleb roared, not with the panic of a victim, but with the absolute stabilizing command of a leader. He drove his fists upward, once, twice. On the third brutal, calculated thrust, the blockage dislodged. The large man collapsed forward, gasping violently for air, sobbing as oxygen flooded his lungs. Caleb didn't let him hit the ground. He caught the heavy man, lowering him gently to the pavement, resting a large, calloused hand on the man's shaking back until the paramedics arrived. The crowd hadn't run away. They had formed a circle of support. Caleb looked down at his own trembling hands. For a decade, he believed these hands were only engineered to inflict casualties. But today, surrounded by the terrified, grateful tears of the man he just saved, Caleb realized his hands were capable of holding life, too. Sometimes, the hardest war a soldier will ever fight is the one that allows him to finally put down his armor and believe he is worthy of peace. If you've ever had to completely break down to finally find exactly where you belong, let the world know your story in the comments below. We all need to know we aren't walking this road alone. Later that evening, as the market began to wind down, Elena Rostova walked up to Caleb. She wasn't holding a hidden microphone. She was holding a thick, hardcover book. The cover featured a stark, beautiful silhouette of a man and a dog standing immovable in front of a police cruiser. The title read, "The Shield of the Street: How a Neighborhood Fought an Empire." It hit the bestseller list this morning. Elena smiled, her dark eyes warm. I wanted the man who started it all to have the first signed copy. Caleb took the book, the weight of it heavy and real in his hands. He shook his head slowly, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of his eyes. "I didn't start it, Elena. I just refused to let it end." The golden hour sun dipped low, bathing the concrete in a rich amber glow. Caleb walked toward the far end of the market, where the brightest neon sign in the plaza buzzed with a vibrant electric pink glow. Mrs. Mai's Bun Rio. The stall was immaculate, stainless steel counters gleaming. Mrs. Mai, wearing a brand new spotless yellow apron, saw him approaching. She didn't ask for his order, and she violently waved away the $5 bill he tried to place on the counter. She simply smiled, a smile that held the warmth of 1,000 sunrises, and pressed a massive, steaming porcelain bowl of golden broth into his hands. Caleb walked over to a small wooden chair set up explicitly for him under the awning. He sat down with a heavy, contented sigh. At his feet, Brutus stretched out luxuriantly in the last ray of the setting sun, resting his scarred, heavy head directly across the toe of Caleb's combat boot. Caleb took a slow breath, the smell of the rich, simmered crab broth mixed with the cool San Francisco evening air. He watched the diverse, chaotic, beautiful flow of human life moving safely through the market. He listened for the echoes of the desert, for the phantom gunfire, for the ghosts that had haunted his dark apartment for 6 agonizing years. There was nothing. Only the low, happy thumping of his dog's tail against the pavement, and the steady, calm beating of his own healing heart. Caleb Thorne picked up his chopsticks, the steam rising into the neon light, and finally, completely, knew that he was home. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen right on the sidewalks of our daily lives. You do not need to be a trained soldier to be a shield for someone else. Just a simple act of kindness or the courage to stand your ground can change a life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that good still exists. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more. May God bless you and your loved ones, giving you the strength to help those who have fallen. If you believe in the healing power of kindness and second chances, type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for listening.